$1 billion. That's what we spend every year to support the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation. Is this a necessary and worthwhile expense? Well, some people say that the CBC nurtures Canadian culture. But in reality, private TV broadcasters spend more on Canadian programming, and their Canadian programs are more popular than the CBC's. As for Canadian music, the CBC has opposed fair streaming royalty rates for musicians, and it now pays rates that are a tiny fraction of what Spotify pays in the USA. Of course, the CBC does have some excellent productions, such as Go Public. But that does not cost $1 billion. So then, how does the CBC spend our $1 billion tax dollars? And who benefits? Well, the CBC president earns roughly $500,000 every year. Each vice president earns about $400,000. In addition, 700 other CBC employees earn over $100,000 per year, but the CBC has refused to disclose their actual salaries. Apparently, CBC management does not feel accountable to Canadian taxpayers, but many taxpayers don't want to support the CBC. In fact, recent market research indicates that 45% of Canadians support privatizing the CBC. Perhaps some of them remember that in the early 2000s, the CBC was found guilty of defaming two Canadian doctors. One of the doctors later remarked that anytime you take on the CBC, you're confronting an organization that takes a scorched earth approach backed by the financial resources of Canadian taxpayers. Well, for people with minor issues, a more practical approach is to complain to the CBC Ombudsman. But some people believe the Ombudsman is biased in favor of the CBC, and there is some convincing evidence. So, has the CBC taken sensible precautions to avoid bias? For example, do they insist that the Ombudsman be an unbiased outsider, such as a retired judge? Of course, an insider, such as a CBC employee, might naturally be inclined to favor his own colleagues and the CBC. Obviously, with such a clear conflict of interest, no CBC employee should ever be appointed as the Ombudsman. But here's the astonishing reality. Every individual who has ever been appointed as the Ombudsman has been a former CBC employee. For example, the current Ombudsman was previously employed by the CBC for over 25 years. So why has this obvious conflict of interest been consistently ignored? Well, maybe the CBC has never really wanted the Ombudsman to be impartial. Instead, perhaps the Ombudsman's true function is to create the mere appearance of fairness while covering up the most serious mistakes to avoid embarrassment. Maybe CBC executives worry that admitting to the CBC's more embarrassing mistakes could turn the public against them and encourage even more cuts in government funding. But if they're so worried about government funding, what other compromises might they make? Would they bias CBC reporting to favor the government just to avoid funding cuts? After all, the Prime Minister does control the CBC's funding, and he does appoint the CBC's Board of Directors and President. This creates a conflict of interest. The government wields too much power over the CBC, and the CBC's editorial slant can have considerable influence on our elections. In addition, with its billion-dollar taxpayer funding, the CBC has an unfair advantage over independent news media. The very survival of our independent news media is at risk. Clearly, some big changes are needed. To begin with, the CBC should stop depending on government support. Instead, it should seek voluntary donations from whichever Canadians choose to support the CBC. This would make the CBC responsible directly to Canadians, not to the government. For example, Canadian personal tax forms could have a box allowing individuals to specify a voluntary donation to the CBC. These voluntary, anonymous, tax-deductible donations should be the only source of funding for the CBC. Canadians should never be forced to support the CBC against their will. Furthermore, the CBC's Board of Directors, the President, and the Ombudsman should be elected by all Canadian voters during federal elections. The CBC's top officials should never be appointed by the government. And to avoid any conflict of interest, no journalist or former CBC employee should ever be allowed to serve as the CBC Ombudsman. These changes will make the CBC a reliable source of unbiased news accountable directly to all Canadians.